Hi everyone, my name is Monza, and in collaboration with FrameLeap today, we're going to be testing the RTX 5080 in The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt Next Gen version. Let's get into it. We start with the in-game presets at 4K to low versus RT Ultra with NVIDIA Hairworks. The difference is huge, about 130 frames, 206 versus 70. Without ray tracing, the full range opens up. Moving from low to medium, high, and ultra, each step drops around 10 frames, down to about 170 on high and 120 on ultra. Now we add ray tracing. With RT, we fall from 120 to 83 FPS, and RT Ultra drops further to 73. Enabling Hairworks costs a bit more, around 2 frames. Alright, moving on to 1440p, same presets. Between low and ultra, the gap now grows to 240 frames. And comparing just the standard in-game presets, we see huge jumps too. Low to ultra goes from 361 frames to 215. Then as we switch from ultra to RT presets, the situation is similar. Ultra preset is 213 frames. Turn on ray tracing, it's 136. The RT Ultra preset drops us to 113, and adding Hairworks eats another 7 frames, landing us at 106. Now let's compare the visual presets in-game. On RT Ultra, we see detailed lighting with shadows from grass and trees. On the standard RT preset, global illumination is still present, so depth and contrast remain. By Ultra, those effects are mostly gone, but the scene still looks full with plenty of grass. As we lower the settings, the reduced draw distance becomes more noticeable. In the second scene, we start with a short comparison, Hairworks on and off. RT Ultra shows the most detailed lighting and shadows. On RT, the effect is weaker, and on Ultra, it's largely absent. Overall, as settings drop, we see fewer shadows, less ambient occlusion, and lower texture quality. Let's check DLSS presets. On quality, we get 60 frames. Balanced gives us 70. As we go to DLSS 4.5, its performance mode gives us just 5 frames more, and ultra performance pushes us up to 98 frames. At 1440p, here's the picture. With the DLSS at the quality preset, we get 96 FPS. Balanced gives us 105. Performance pushes us to 111, and Ultra Performance gives us 128. Let's dive into ray tracing performance. For all ray tracing options, we've only got 2 options, on or off. With ray traced reflections, the difference between on and off is just 2 or 3 frames. Visually, the image changes, but it's still sometimes hard to tell what's RT reflection and what's SSR. With ray trace shadows enabled, we're getting a big visual difference. Dense bushes and grass cast shadows, really enhancing the scene. Same as RT reflections, the difference in FPS is minimal, just 2 or 3 FPS. Next, ray trace ambient occlusion. Visually doesn't change the visual picture much. Performance difference, once again, just 2 or 3 frames. The difference is mostly noticeable indoors. Speaking of performance, ray traced global illumination has quality and performance options, differing by just 2 frames. Turning off reflections, shadows, and AO gains us only about 10 FPS. That's less than you'd expect, while the visuals drop a lot. Turning off RT entirely makes the image worse, but FPS jumps from 71 to 91. So can we keep ray tracing but lower settings? On low, we get 83 FPS. With Hairworks on, 80. On Ultra Plus, it's 65. That's not a huge difference that we saw previously when RT was off. Now let's jump into the game itself. We start at 4K, DLSS 4 set to quality, maxed out settings, and NVIDIA Hairworks on. At the beginning of the game, we are roughly 50 to 60 FPS. It's important to note that FPS drops not so much in cities, but in forested areas, where more trees and shadows are at play. All of this affects the overall picture. Regarding the input lag, we get around 16 to 20 milliseconds. Once we add frame generation into the mix, things improve. FPS climbs to around 80 to 90, which is a great boost to the previous values. Based on RLAT values from NVIDIA statistics, we get around 20 to 25 milliseconds of input. Important note, RLAT values are usually higher as it measures end-to-end system latency. So, RLAT includes mouse latency, game engine, input queue, CPU render queue with GPU render time, and much more. Let's try to get 60 FPS in the forest areas by switching to DLSS balanced. Still, we are getting roughly 50 to 55 FPS now, which is not a bad result that we believe can be improved by using frame generation. Regarding the input lag, just like with DLSS quality, we get around 16 to 20 milliseconds. And now once we enable frame generation on top of DLSS balanced, performance increases to around 80 to 100 FPS outside Novigrad. This is a pretty substantial improvement compared to the non-frame gen result. At this point, frame generation is doing exactly what you would expect. Not necessarily making the game more playable, since we were already above 60 FPS, but improving frame pacing, camera smoothness, and overall presentation on higher refresh rate displays. Now we step down from RT Ultra to standard ray tracing global illumination, still at 4K, with DLSS set to quality, and Hairworks enabled. Right away, performance improves compared to RT Ultra. We're now seeing around 70 to 80 FPS in the demanding areas. Visually, the difference is subtle at first glance, but lighting and shadow depth are slightly reduced. Still, the overall image remains very impressive, and this preset starts to feel more balanced between visuals and performance. Now let's enable frame generation. Performance increases from around 70 to 80 FPS to roughly 90 to 100 FPS, which is a pretty noticeable uplift at 4K with ray tracing and Hairworks still enabled. Input latency rises to around 22 milliseconds, but overall the game feels responsive enough for regular gameplay. Now let's go back and switch from DLSS quality to the balanced preset. Compared to quality mode, performance becomes a bit more consistent, staying around 70 to 75 FPS in heavier outdoor areas with the input lag around 13 milliseconds. The visual difference during gameplay is relatively small, especially while moving through the world, but the extra headroom helps reduce some of the heavier drops in dense scenes. And now with frame generation enabled, performance climbs to around 110 FPS. That's roughly a 10 FPS improvement compared to the DLSS quality plus frame generation result, while still keeping the visual quality very close overall. For the input lag, now we get around 18 to 20 milliseconds. Now let's move away from ray tracing and see how the RT 5080 performs with Ultra Plus settings and Hairworks enabled at full 4K. With DLSS 4 set to quality mode, performance lands at around 95 FPS in heavier forested areas, and climbs to roughly 110 FPS inside the city. Just like before, forests remain more demanding because of the dense vegetation and shadows. Input latency stays very low, at around 7 to 10 milliseconds. Compared to the RT presets, this already gives the GPU significantly more breathing room, while still keeping most of the visual fidelity intact. Now let's add frame generation on top of that. Performance immediately jumps into the 130 to 140 FPS range outside of Novigrad, which is a massive uplift considering we're still running at 4K with Ultra Plus settings and Hairworks enabled. At this point, jumping to a higher frame rate is more beneficial for high refresh rate monitors. Motion looks cleaner. Latency rises slightly to around 13 milliseconds. Next, let's switch from the DLSS quality to balanced mode. This pushes performance slightly higher with around 110 to 115 FPS in heavier forest scenes and roughly 130 FPS inside the city. Input latency remains unchanged compared with DLSS quality at around 7 to 10 milliseconds. And finally, combining DLSS balanced with frame generation, pushes the RTX 5080 to around 140 to 150 FPS outside Novigrad. The additional generated frames mostly improve motion clarity and frame pacing. Latency increases slightly to around 13 to 15 milliseconds, but controls still feel responsive enough for a slower paced RPG like this. Now let's move down to 1440p and bring RT Ultra back into the picture. With DLSS 4 quality enabled, performance stays around 85 FPS in heavier forest areas and roughly 85 to 90 FPS in the city. Even with full RT Ultra settings and Hairworks enabled, the game already runs comfortably, much above 60 FPS. Latency sits around 12 milliseconds, keeping gameplay responsive during combat and exploration. Adding frame generation gives a very noticeable uplift here. Performance jumps to around 140 to 150 FPS outside Novigrad, which makes frame pacing and camera movement look significantly cleaner on high refresh displays. Latency rises slightly to around 13 to 15 milliseconds. Responsiveness still feels very comfortable. Next, let's move from DLSS quality to balance mode. Performance improves to around 90 to 100 FPS outside Novigrad, giving the GPU slightly more room in heavier scenes. At the same time, image quality remains surprisingly close to quality mode during actual gameplay, especially in motion, just like at 4K. Latency also drops closer to 10 milliseconds. Now adding frame generation on top of DLSS balanced pushes performance to around 150 to 160 FPS. At this point, the game feels extremely consistent even during fast traversal through larger open areas. Latency lands around 12 to 14 milliseconds, which still feels perfectly fine for The Witcher 3. Finally, let's try performance mode for DLSS 4.5 with RT Ultra. Performance now ranges between 90 and 105 FPS outside Novigrad, which is actually not far off balanced mode in this scenario. The image does become a little sharper compared to balanced. Latency remains around 10 milliseconds overall. Now let's slightly reduce the RT settings while staying at 1440p. With DLSS quality enabled, performance rises to around 95 to 100 FPS outside Novigrad. Compared to RT Ultra, the visual downgrade during gameplay is relatively minor, but the additional performance headroom is immediately noticeable. Latency ranges between 10 and 14 milliseconds. Adding frame generation boosts performance all the way up to around 160 to 170 FPS outside the city. Again, the biggest difference here is in overall presentation rather than necessity. Motion clarity improves and traversal feels more consistent on high refresh rate displays. Latency rises slightly to around 13 to 15 milliseconds. Switching to DLSS balanced keeps performance around 90 to 100 FPS. Even in heavier forest scenes outside of Novigrad. Compared to the quality preset in the same scenes, we should expect a boost of up to 10 to 15 FPS. At the same time, latency drops to roughly 8 to 10 milliseconds, making controls feel slightly more immediate. Now combining DLSS balanced with frame generation pushes performance to around 170 FPS outdoors. The gains are most noticeable during traversal and fast camera movement, particularly on high refresh monitors. Latency lands around 12 to 15 milliseconds, which still feels very comfortable in gameplay. Finally, DLSS performance mode delivers around 105 FPS outside Novigrad. Latency remains very low, at around 7 to 10 milliseconds, making this one of the more responsive ray tracing configurations overall. And despite the aggressive upscaling mode, image quality still holds up fairly well in motion. Now let's disable ray tracing completely and move to Ultra Plus settings with Hairworks. Immediately, performance jumps to around 130 to 150 FPS outside Novigrad, showing just how much RT impacts GPU load in this game. Latency also drops dramatically to around 6 to 7 milliseconds, making controls feel extremely responsive. Adding frame generation here produces some pretty insane numbers. We're now seeing around 240 FPS inside Novigrad and roughly 210 FPS outside the city. At this point, the gains mostly benefit super high refresh rate monitors, where frame pacing and motion clarity continue improving. The input latency still remains around 10 milliseconds. Next, switching to DLSS balanced pushes performance even higher. Outdoor frame rates now sit between 160 and 170 FPS, occasionally dropping closer to 140 FPS in heavier areas. Latency stays extremely low at around 5 to 10 milliseconds. Combining DLSS balanced with frame generation pushes performance into the 220 to 250 FPS range outdoors. At this point, The Witcher 3 is already running far beyond what the game realistically needs. Still, frame pacing looks exceptionally clean and remains at around 9 to 10 milliseconds. Finally, DLSS Performance Mode delivers around 150 FPS outside Novigrad while keeping latency between 6 and 7 milliseconds. For players who simply want the highest possible frame rates without ray tracing, this configuration delivers excellent overall performance with extremely low input latency. Thank you so much for watching this video by FrameLeap and Monza. We hope you enjoyed. Leave your comments down below and we'll see you in the next video.